So we'll record the session, but then we'll stop the recording after the session. So yeah, so welcome. So I'll explain a bit about what Power Apps Nights. I decided to rename it last night to Power Apps Nights. I was thinking about doing put a key on it, but I think Power Apps Nights is fine where it is. Explain a bit about it, and then we'll get into the technical stuff as soon as possible. So what is Power Apps Nights? It's inclusive Power Apps training. Inclusivity is something I feel quite passionate about. And so the reason why it's inclusive is because they run at 8 p.m. so hopefully not interfere with anybody's working day and any family commitments. And the sessions will also be recorded and made available on the group's YouTube channel. So on the Virtual Power Group's YouTube channel, we'll start putting the videos, the sessions up there as well. During the sessions, I'll be demonstrating some concepts in a trial environment, and we'll encourage attendees to do the same. So they should all have an environment set up and details to that and to log into that environment, just so you can walk through the kind of technical bits with us. And we'll spend about 30 minutes on that. And we also want to prompt discussion. So as well as a technical walkthrough, we really want to get people involved in discussion, because some of the concepts covered will be my opinions, and feel free to challenge them. I'm all up to have my opinions challenged. My opinions are certainly not right a lot of the time. One of the things that I've learned with working for the Power Platform in Dynamics 365 is that the only thing that means sure about working with it is that you'll never stop learning. So I'm here to learn too. And so that's after the session, we'll have a kind of 30-minute discussion, discuss the topics covered, and find out how you think you might do things differently from me. We'll also have some hands-on labs. I was hoping to provide some documentation to go along with this, and I've not finished it yet. It took a bit longer to create and had a few hiccups in regards to setting up all the environments last night. So I'm running a bit behind, but I'll hopefully have the documents up by the end of the week, kind of similar to the App in a Day document. It's just a guide, so that anybody picking up who doesn't want to sit through and watch a video, or who missed bits of the session, can just go through that. We're going to be following Microsoft's guidance on this, so there's no point in reinventing the wheel. The Microsoft learning material is very good these days, and there's a lot of exercise. So there may be a lot of exercise in this that look familiar if you've attended the App in a Day or worked through the Microsoft Learn content. We're not doing it to the book of the Microsoft Learn content. We're just taking bits out of it because those examples work quite well, and putting our own spin on it, and maybe going into a bit more detail on best practices on each of the App in a Day and the MS Learn content. Because one of the things that the Learn content doesn't seem to do is give you an insight into other people's experience in doing those functions. It tells you how to technically do it. Again, it doesn't to give you best practices or give you an insight into why you're doing it. And oops. It's also Virtual Power Group member led. The whole purpose of this is so that we can all learn something and all kind of chip in and have a go and share the love, so to speak, for Microsoft business applications. So we want your feedback and input to determine what subjects to cover. I'm just starting this off inclusive Power Platform training, just because that's what I'm passionate about, and I believe that everybody should be able to get to, every community member should be able to get Power Platform training and not have to give up a day of work, etc. Or it's available at a time where it's less disruptive to your family. And so I'm passionate about this, but if there's anything else that you want to see covered, I'm sure we can find an expert or try and accommodate you, an expert on that subject, or try and accommodate as best we can. Or if you even want to run a session, just please get in contact with us and we'll certainly set something up for you. So it's member-led. So the first session is Power Apps Nights, a custom entity checklist. So what we're going to be doing in this session, we're going to be creating a custom entity. The reason we're doing that is because that's one of the first things that you'll be doing when you learn about Power Apps. And a lot of Power App professionals, Power Platform professionals, think nothing of creating a custom entity. But I think that's quite incorrect, because there's a lot more involved in doing it properly than just hitting create and then create an entity. Your entity has to mean something. There's a lot of things that can easily be missed, and by missing those things, it can cause problems. So one of the problems it can cause, it's really annoying when you have to go miss something and then you have to go back and revisit it later. So that affects your scope creep as well. And it's also more annoying when someone else misses something and you have to go back and fix their bit that they've missed. And you end up taking more time over the task than you initially estimated. And so having a checklist promotes consistency for both yourself and the rest of your team. So here is my checklist. I can't state enough that it's my checklist. Other people may have different checklists, but probably quite similar. And I'm hoping it's something that will come out in the discussion after this session. Maybe there's something that I've missed off my checklist. Someone mentioned something the other day that I'd never even thought of. So hopefully when we have the bit of the open forum discussion, you can give me some insight into what kind of checklist, if you're an experienced consultant, that you would have. And so what we'll do today, we'll create a custom entity. While we're doing that, we'll explain each item in my checklist. The custom entity we'll create is a device entity. And we're doing a device entity because that's what's based, that's the app in the day. So when you do app in the day, if anybody's ever done it, you get a spreadsheet full of data to run your Canvas app off of. And we've already got a model-driven app created, so we'll look at that model-driven app, and then we'll just create that device entity and go through this checklist as we do it. So let's get to the build. So you should all have user accounts set up. If you've not got user accounts and environments set up, just tag Claire or Reese in the chat and they'll be able to provide you with a username and password. So if you want to work along with us, if you can open up an incognito or in private browser session and just go to the make.powerapps.com URL and log in with your environment details. And while you do that, I'll just make sure I can get logged in with mine. And I'll just need to share my other screen as well. So let's start with the first item on the list. If we're all in make.powerapps.com, the first item on the list is prerequisites. So this is before you even decide you're going to create an entity. You've got to make sure that you're in the right environment. And in the top right-hand corner of the Maker Studio, you can see the environment list. And if you click on that, you've got a list of environments there. You'll have a productivity database environment. That's just this environment. That's something you'll maybe see that as come up as the default environment. I rename that environment to productivity do not create database. The reason I do that is because Microsoft told me to do it. I was at the admin and day session and they said the first thing to do is rename your default environment and don't create a database on it. I don't actually know why, but that was the advice, so that's what I do. That's for personal productivity. You should have access to one attendee is the parent training environment. But if you select the attendee environment, that's what you'll be working to do. And that's your environment. We've set up 30 days trials for everybody. So that's your environment to take away and play with as you please for 30 days. So that's the first prerequisite is make sure you're in the correct environment. Got another prerequisite is make sure your entity doesn't exist in the environment. Now that isn't really an issue when it comes to Power Platform or creating a Power App if it's just the Power Platform CDS that you've got installed. It really becomes a problem if you've got other applications installed or you've got a lot of different people using applications in your system, or if you've got a D365 account. So it's just always worth checking. The first thing on your checklist before you create a custom entity is if there's anything else in the system that does that or shares the functionality of that entity. So you do that by clicking Data and clicking Entities. Now it says we're in a pretty clean common data service environment, so we shouldn't see anything that's going to be the same as a device entity in there. But again, if you're in a D365 environment, there might be a product entity that could be used as a device, or you could reuse that thing. Or there might even be another entity of the type that you want to create, in which case you maybe need to speak to whoever's owns ownership of that entity. And the last thing we need to do for the prerequisites, if we've decided we're going to create an entity, is create it in a solution. It's really tempting, especially when you're starting out, just to click new entity, or when you're under pressure, even if you're not just starting out. A bad habit is just to hit create new entity. If you hit create new entity, you're not creating your entity in a controlled manner. You want to click solutions and you want to add your entity to a solution. And that's the best practice as handed down by Microsoft, because you're grouping functionalities together, and the chances are you'll want to move that to a different environment at some point. So if you click on solutions, you'll see that you've got this device procurement. I'm not going to get into solutions today, because that's another session in itself. But you've already got an unmanaged solution in there called device procurement. And if you open that up, let's just go ahead and create our custom entity. So click new and entity. And the first thing you've got here is the name field. And that's the next item on my checklist, is the name field. Now, why is it on the checklist? Because how are you going to miss that out? Well, you can miss it out. You can actually set this as non-required. You've got to make sure that this is a field that's going to be populated. This is the primary key, the primary descriptive field of your entity. It's used at the top of the form, and it's used in lookups. So if for any reason you're not putting you're not populating the name field, for example, if you have an intersect entity that just used to connect two other entities together, then you might have to do some business rules around that to improve the user experience, or users are just going to see a lot of blank spaces in their views. So let's call our entity a name, and we'll call it device, because that's what we're going to be. That's the function of our entity. It's going to be a device such as a laptop that we're going to, or a machine or a mouse that we're going to order. It already populates the plural name, and again, this is the name field that's important. Always check whether you're going to populate that name field, and you can rename that if you want. The second item on my checklist is more settings, and again, this is something that gets missed out so often. It's so tempting just to hit create and move on to the next step, but more settings actually gives you time to think about what's the purpose of your entity. So it acts as a mini checklist. And again, we're creating this entity because there's a piece in our puzzle that's missing. We want to make a solution, and something's missing that the common data service doesn't already offer, or an environment doesn't offer. So we have to put a bit of thought into what that entity is going to represent. And I always, rather than skip past, I always just check this, check out what's missed, what else we've got in these more settings. The description is the first thing, and I would recommend we always put a description in, because devices might mean something to us, but it might mean something completely separate to someone else. So let's put a description in. We'll just put a device a user can order, e.g. a laptop. The next thing you've got is entity type and ownership. Now I've got a bit of a story here. Entity type, we're going to talk about standard entities just now. We're not going to look at activity entity, but this is a standard entity. I'm not going to get activities in this session, but I've got a story around ownership. And there's a bit of it happened a good few years ago now, but ownership determines whether you've got an owner field on your entity. And it's used to determine who can access your entity, whether it's organization-wide. And if it's organization-wide, people can either access it or they can't. If it's user or team owned, then you've got the whole spectrum of security roles that can some people maybe to read it, some people maybe to write it, and it's based on that ownership field that's determined. And a story I had again is a big system we were implementing, and we set it to organization, and then halfway through the build, I mean, this has gone on for several years, this project. It was back in the days where projects did last several years. They decided that they wanted to add security roles and secure this entity that was organization thing, and they already had data and everything in it. And so there was a big a bit of a battle and a data migration and a data cleanse to delete the entity and create a new entity with that as user or team owned. And so just from that experience, I always put my entities to be user or team owned, because you're not going to change it further down the line to organizational, and it's very unlikely you're going to do that. The collaboration bit, again, I'm not going to go into each of these options, but this is a checklist to think about what your entity is about. Are you going to connect it to other entities via connections? Are you going to send emails to that entity record? Does it need enable for document management? So that just gives you something to think about. And sometimes when I'm designing a system, I'll just open up this screen and I'll think about these different options when I'm doing the system design, to think about what that entity represents. Some important ones down here is enable quick forms. We're going to enable that because that comes into one of the checks that we've got later, and duplicate detection. And that's all we're going to look at in there today. So those more settings, so it's just always worth checking them, and just give yourself a bit of food for thought about what your entity is going to represent and how it's going to fit into the system. So to create the entity, we'll just click create now. And if you follow along with me, you'll see that that'll provision it in the background, and we'll see that pop up in a second now. Because the next thing that we're going to look at is adding fields. So that's the main attribute. That's the attributes that'll create your database. Think of an entity as a table and the fields as the columns within that table. So some find it easier to add fields from the form, and you can add fields from the form. If you click on form and open up the main form, you can add fields from here. But the problem with adding fields from here is that certain field types, such as option sets and lookups, aren't available as field types. So you end up going and saving and going in and out of your form editor, and that's quite time consuming. So I like to take all my fields in here, and as I said, that's kind of building blocks of your entity. So that's the best place to start. And again, it makes your entity mean something. So we'll add some fields into our entity, and we're going to add, and if you work along with me, we're going to add a price field of type currency. And we're just going to add a field. We're not going to build the whole entity, and we can do that as part of the on-hands lab later. And again, always put a description field in. I'll tell you another story from my experience with description fields. It's quite easy, especially when you're creating a lot of fields on an entity, just to dismiss the description field and not populate it. And the only excuse for doing that is just because you've been lazy. And that's something that I did once in the past. I have to hold my hands up and say I did that once. Well, more than once actually. I got caught once. And then the customer asked me, the description field actually displays as tooltips when you hover over the field. And one of the customer asked me, he says, look at all those tooltips there. All these fields display tooltips. They're really helpful. Why don't these ones not display tooltips? And I said, oh yeah, the tooltips set at the description field on the attribute and their custom attributes. And he goes, well, why are they not displaying as tooltips? And it is really hard to hold your hand up and say it was because I didn't put them in there. And I think I kind of jazzed it up a bit. And I said it'd be too time consuming to do it for the budget. But the truth was, it was just sheer laziness, and I should have put them in there. So that's a difficult conversation that could have been avoided. And now from now on, I always put description in the description field because I don't want to have to face that again. So in the description field, we're going to put for the price, how much the device costs. And we'll click done, and that creates a price field. The next thing we'll do is we will create a manufacturer field. So this is the manufacturer of the item. And that's a lookup field. And that allows us to create a relationship between our device entity and the manufacturer entity. And our manufacturer is going to be an account. And again, always put a description in. So that's the fourth item on our checklist. For the fifth item on our checklist, once we save our entity, is relationships. Now we've just created a relationship by creating the manufacturer field. If we click in there and advanced options, we can see the name of that relationship. And if we click into relationships, we should be able to find that. And that's it there. So what kind of information have we got in there? And what do we need to check? Well, there's the lookup field display name. That's fine. We've already set that by creating the lookup field on the device. We've got description, which is good. Don't need to bother with that. Then you've got these advanced options. And this is a type of behavior. This is an important one. So we've got a referential behavior type here. That means that the relationship, the association is just referential. So if I do anything like delete or share or change ownership, the manufacturer entity, nothing happens to the child. Nothing happens to the child entities underneath it. But I can change that to parental. I can also change it to custom. And if we choose custom, we can see all the different options that affect that behavior. And cascade all is what happens to the parent entity happens to all the children all the child ones. So that's something that sometimes gets overlooked. A lot of people just think referential by default and that's it. And that's most of the time what you'll do. But if you have a custom entity that you want, if I assign that to someone else, so if I assign that entity to someone else and I want that person to take ownership of all the child records, then you might want to look at a custom or parent type of behavior there. We'll keep it as referential for now. Another thing to look in here in the relationships is this is something that's missed quite often, and we have to switch to classic view to view this. So if we click anywhere else on the screen and click the ellipse and switch to classic, we'll have a look at relationship mappings. And relationship mappings allow us to map fields from the parent record to the child record. And that comes in handy when you're creating a new record from, say, a subgrid on an entity form, on a parent entity form. So when you click the plus in the subgrid, you want to map any fields that are on the parent entity down to the child entity so that they link along and the user doesn't need to populate them again. And this is something that's missed quite frequently. So let's open our relationship. And if I look at mappings, and to create a new mapping, click new, and we're going to create a mapping between the currency field. And the currency field was created at the same time we created the price field. Let's just make that a bit bigger. So now that mapping's there, any device that's created from within the context of the account will have the same currency mapped from the account, if we've got multiple currencies. And let's just close that down. Another thing to look at here when we're talking about relationships is the parent entity as well. And if we look at the form of that parent entity, back up a level to the solution, notice that account, because we've changed that entity as well by bringing it by creating the relationship to the device, that's now in our solution. And again, if we open the account, and we need to switch to classic view to view this as well, for now anyway, and we have a look at the account form. In creating that relationship, it's added device to our navigation menu, and that displays in the command bar of the account. So if you've got quite a big system with a lot of different relationships, particularly if you've got several account fields, account relationships on your device menu, you could end up with a whole load of items down here, all named devices. So that's something to think about as well. Do you need a link to that in the related account menu? And in order to remove that, if you didn't, you click navigation, select it, and click remove. The next thing on our checklist is forms. So let's have a look at what forms are created when we've created a device. And forms the part where your user will spend most of their time in the entity, so it's important to get them right. We've got three forms. We've got a quick view form, a card, and a main form. Let's have a look at the main form just now. I'm not going to go into too much into form design. We're just going to put some fields on the form. But one thing I want to mention here as well is the name of this form, which says information. It doesn't tell us a lot about what the form's for. I always like to rename that to either be relative to the app that you're building in, because you may have multiple forms, which serve different purposes. But if I've only got one form, I always also like to change that to the name of the entity. And as I said, you'd probably have more fields to add, but if you're designing your form, you can just drag and drop your fields over onto the form. And we'll do a future session on different things that different components that you can put on a form. I'm back. Can you hear me?
Hello. Can hear you now,
oh,
yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Where did I get to before I disconnected?
You just added on the manufacturer field to the form.
Cool. Right, let's go back to there then.
Another Virgin Media customer for the win.
It's been terrible actually the last few weeks, isn't it? Well, for me,
Really.
anyway. Right. Okay. So so I put the manufacturer's field on. I'm probably going to have to. I'm just going to save this and go back before putting the price one on. I'll save it. I did move the price one on, but it doesn't seem to be there because my internet connection dropped. Yeah, so we've got the manufacturer and price fields on the form now. So what other forms have we got? We've got the quick view form. That's the default quick view form. Another form that we're missing here is the quick create form. And remember, we enabled our entity for quick create, and quick create is the little form that comes in at the side. I'll show you what a quick create form is. So your quick create form is this form here. And again, this is something that gets overlooked so many times, not just when creating new custom entities, but when adding existing entities to the form, is that they don't, some consultants just forget to amend the quick create form. And so we're going to have to create a quick create form for our entity. So if we go back to our solution, and go to forms, if I click add a new form, and add a quick create form, because it can be detrimental to the user experience, particularly again if you're using an existing entity and you're just using the default quick create form as opposed to your custom form. And we'll just put the manufacturer and the price on there. And where's the name? And we can save that. And another form we've got is the card form. And card was a new one. If you open that, you'll get the classic interface. A card is, I don't think I've got an example of a card I could show you. It's when, have you seen, if you look at accounts and contacts and you hover over the contact and it displays a little card that comes up. It contains 11 fields. It can display a maximum of 11 fields on it. It's worth setting this now, even if you're not going to use card items. It's worth just putting the fields on the form and making it mean something, so that if someone does enable that entity in the future, if you do enable the card functionality in the future on a subgrid, then they don't just get a meaningless form pop up. And the next thing we're going to think about on the checklist, which is number 7, is views. And views are your grids. So when you look at an entity, and an example of a view is here, you've got your grid along here. If you look at what the views that just create an entity gives us, they don't give us much. They just give us the name and then created on. And so if we create an entity, we've put all this effort into making our entity mean something with our attributes, and then we don't put them on the view. That, again, that's detrimental to user experience, because then they have to click into the record or create their own custom personal views in order to view the data on that. You want them to see what that record means fairly quickly. And we're just going to edit the active view just now. So you just edit again by clicking and dragging the different fields over and changing the width. Now here's a tip, and I'll put this in the documentation once I finish doing it. We need to really create views, amend the different views, the associated views, the lookup views for each items. But there's a tool in the XML toolbox called the View Layout Replicator, which allows you to do that quite quickly. So I'll put a note of that in the documentation that goes with this. Also, to note with views is to be very careful with your lookup view and not change the first column on that, unless you really know what you're doing. So the first column is the name. So any lookup field that you see will display the name. If you change this view in any way, it might cause some unexpected behavior. I think it's the best term for it. And again, when we're in views, an important view to amend is the quick find view. So you want people to find your entity. And again, this is something as well that I see things go live. Accounts with maybe that they haven't scoped correctly, where they want to search for a postcode that the view hasn't been amended. You can add find by columns in here to make your entity findable, searchable. So we can add the manufacturer column in there, and that means that anybody looking for an entity, searching for the device name or the device manufacturer, that record will be pulled back. It's also worth noting that your quick find view is filtered as well. So at this moment in time, this will only pull back active devices. But we're going to leave it like that. And so next on our list is number 8. So we've got an entity record just now, but no one can access it because it's not on the sitemap. So we need to add that to the sitemap. So if we go back to our solution, or device procurement solution, and we've got device procurement model driven app. For some reason, I'm in the habit, it's just my own personal choice, I always edit the app as opposed to edit the sitemap directly. That's just me. But you can edit the sitemap from within the app. And just for this example, we're going to create a new area, and we're going to call it devices. And then we'll create a group within that area, We're just going to call this one devices as well, just for simplicity. And a sub area, and we'll look up to that entity, our new one that we've created. And that's all we need to do at this stage. You can click save and then publish it. And so now we've got our entity created. It's added to the sitemap. All our views are all looking good. Let's just have a look at what that entity looks like by running our app or refreshing the page. You can run the app. From click and play here as well. Let's go to devices, and we see straight away that it's got this brilliant icon here. This is my favorite icon, actually, believe it or not. And I wish I could take credit for this as well, but it was actually a podcast I heard it on, somebody describing it. But it's the best icon in the system because it's a jigsaw puzzle piece. It represents exactly what a custom entity is. It's a missing piece in the puzzle. As much as I like that icon, I don't want to see it in my navigation menu because I've seen so many systems that have thousands, hundreds, maybe thousands, a bit of an overstatement, of jigsaw pieces in there. And as much as a jigsaw piece means something to me, it doesn't represent a device. And again, it's one of those things like not putting descriptions on your entity fields. It's sheer laziness just not doing it. And I'll admit I've been guilty of doing it myself and forgetting about putting an icon, but that's why I put together a checklist so that I don't get caught out with something like that again. And so the next thing that we should do is add an icon to represent devices. So if we go back to our Maker Studio, and when I go to device, and I'm going to show you the standard out-the-box way of adding an icon. I've already uploaded an icon to here, but again, there's another XRM toolbox tool called the Iconator that's worth looking at. And again, I'll put that link to the Iconator in the description in the documentation. But we need to switch to classic view in order to add an icon at the moment. And we've got update icons at the top here. And again, at the moment, because the classic interface is still live, I do still put in the old icons. I'm not going to do it in this session because going forward, hopefully we won't need to. So we would click Unified Interface, and I've actually created an icon already. An icon is a web resource, which you can search for. Click Device. And then click OK. And that's us now got an icon associated to our entity once we save and publish. I've yet to come across a D365 or a Power App that has a jigsaw piece or a puzzle as an entity, which would justify having the jigsaw piece or puzzle icon. So if we refresh the page, that looks a lot more meaningful. It's devices and it looks kind of similar to a laptop. So that's icons. The next, if you want to know more icons, my session on Empower Your Career was all about icons and icon use within Power Apps. So a bit of shameless self-promotion there. You can check that out on the 365 Saturday YouTube channel. The next item on our list is App Clutter. And this isn't really relevant to us right now, but it could be relevant if you've got a bigger system. If we go back to our Power App, and we'll edit that, the device procurement app. When you add the entity to the sitemap, it pulls in the whole entity. So all the forms, and so you might have multiple forms on your custom entity. You might have loads of views on your custom entity that you don't want to pull in. So if you're creating quite a large custom entity, It's always worth thinking about the user of this app, and they don't want to see possibly 27 views in here. They only want to see a couple of views. You want to try and make that as neat as possible. And so you would clear up your app clutter here by unselecting it and just selecting the views that you need. We're just going to keep them all on just now because we're making quite a small app. And again, you save and you publish that. So penultimate item is number 11, which is security roles. We've made our entity visible in the app, but we're system admins, so we can see it, so it looks fine to us. If we were just to hand that up over to a user and say, there you go, they wouldn't be able to see that on the sitemap. And the reason they can't is because they don't have permission yet to view that record type, that entity. And so in order to sort that out, you need to go to a different URL. You need to go to admin.powerplatform.com. This is the Power Platform Admin Center. And if you select your environment and click Settings, then you've got Users and Permissions, and you've got your security roles in there. We haven't got a custom security role, but if we go into, let's just go into Knowledge Manager, and we go to Custom Entities, we need to make sure that any user which needs to see, any user that has to see that device has access to the device entity in their security roles. And lastly, we kept it enabled by default, and by default it's always enabled. We want to set up duplicate detection rules for that entity if required. And to do that, while we're in the admin center, we can click Data Management, Duplicate Detection Rules, and we can set up a new duplicate detection rule there by clicking the new icon. And that's my checklist really. That's us created an entity, made it visible to users, ensured the users can get to it. And we've also made the user experience, should we make it a bit more fluid, and we shouldn't have forgotten anything from creating that entity. So I'll just pull up the last couple of slides. Oops, let's just fly through this. So I'll put you on another screen. Does anybody have any questions before I move on to the closing slides?
We are still here, just don't think there's any questions.
Cool. So yeah, in conclusion, why create a checklist, a custom entity checklist? It's just to improve quality and consistency. Again, like I said at the start, a lot of people, they create a custom entity without properly thinking it through. And I've had specs as well. If someone's writing a spec for you and they don't fully take a checklist of that kind of scale into consideration, you end up getting given a small period of time to create which could be quite a large entity, and all those other checks all just add up to time, and you end up creating scope creep. They improve the user experience. It'll make your app more intuitive, and the information easier to find by your user. And once the entity is built, the task and the plan can be signed off, and you shouldn't need to revisit it later in the project, because again, there's nothing worse than being right down the project further and you find out that something on that list is missing and having to go back and do it for each custom entity. It just takes up a lot of time. And so that's it for tonight's session. Any feedback? There's a 3-question Microsoft form set up to give some feedback. I want to hear what you want to hear about, what you liked about the session, what you didn't like about the session, and a star rating. I'm quite thick-skinned, so please be as honest as possible. I'm just kind of I'm doing this to try and improve my training skills. So hopefully, with the constructive feedback I get, I can make things better for everyone in the future. And that's it for me for the presentation.
Nice one.
So does anyone else have some sort of checklist, or has anybody experienced some of those problems that I raised there that we can come across with people creating custom entities and missing things?